Okay, I guess it's time to begin. Can you hear me? Pardon me? Yeah. Okay, we've been talking in this Wednesday night class about evangelism, and what I thought tonight we would take a little different twist, and we would spend more time talking about Christianity and where we measure up, or I thought it's easy to talk about evangelism, but what do we have to be before we can evangelize? Is there something we have to do? Is there some level of Christianity that we have to have to be able to teach others? So I thought about that, and I thought, well, let's deal with that for a bit. So if you would turn to Hebrews, the 5th chapter, Hebrews 5, verse 12 says to us, "For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you, again, the first principles of the oracles of God, and you have come to need milk and not solid food." So I thought about that, and I thought, it's interesting that when you look at this verse and talking about personal evangelism and what we need to do, and I thought, well, how does that apply to our lives as Christians? What does it mean to teach when we should teach? And I thought about from that perspective. We all know what teachers are, correct? I mean, we have teachers. Well, Rachel's not here, but we have teachers who teach. We call them. I mean, that's their profession. There are people who are teachers who are paid to teach education, and they have certain criteria that they have to fulfill in order to be certified and have a diploma or certificate to teach. But as a Christian, what do we do to teach? I mean, is there a passing grade? Is there something that we have to do to be able to teach others? And then what does it really mean to teach? And hearing nothing yet, one of the things I thought was, did the widow, when she put in her mites, did she teach by giving? Yes, she did. Jesus used her as an example, but it was the practice, it was what she did. She taught, and Jesus was able to use her example of her giving to teach. So sometimes we can teach, as it's used here, by just being a Christian, by being a good person. And what we'll lead to is we'll lead to 2 Peter chapter 1 and talk about some of the things there. But if you remember, if you were at the gospel meeting, one night Tim shared a Christian man that was at lunch or dinner, wherever, I guess it was lunch, and his waitress was busy. It might have been breakfast, but he left a penny. And then he and another brother went to visit a fellow person that needed to be studied with, and he walks in, and it's this. So, and the point of that message of Tim's was, we're Christians all the time. Even when people mistreat us or we feel we get a bad deal, if we're a Christian, then we have to act like a Christian all the time. And I think when we look at this verse, for though by the time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again. If we're not living a Christ-like life every day, then we need to be taught again. And we need to go back to the first principles or the oracles of God, that you've come to need milk and not solid food. Now, I could spend a lot of time talking about solid food and milk because I have a new granddaughter. It's a year old, and I could talk about it, but I won't take time to do that. But we all know that with babies, you don't give them solid food until they're at a certain age, a certain point. We don't have that with Christianity. We don't have your typical system, like in the school system, where when somebody's a certain age, they go to kindergarten, then they go to first grade, and they go through. As Christianity, it's all based on individuals. And so a lot of times, we seem to skirt the responsibility because it's somebody else's job. And we don't, as a body, we don't give grades, and we don't check in each week with, okay, Nancy, what did you do this week? How many people did you talk to? Or what? We don't do that. That's not something that we're required to do, and we don't do it. But it's something that we all should take a look at in our own lives. Am I teaching? Am I an example in the life that I live? You know, when somebody that you're with and they say, well, that person cut you off, you should respond and beep. And when you don't do that, that's teaching. That's saying, I'm somebody different. And then the part about milk. Now, in studying for this, what's interesting is the Hebrew writer is talking to a group that needs to be talked to. And when you look at, in chapter 2, let's go through some of Hebrew. So he's talking to a group here, and he says to the group, first in Hebrews chapter 2, in verse 1, he says to them, therefore, we must give the more earnest heed to the things which we have heard, lest we drift away. What happens to the church today? How many people have drifted away from the church today? A lot. I mean, let's face it. A lot of people who have become Christians have drifted away. And that's really what happens. They just drift away. We can look at rolls and rolls of attendance books and go through and see people who have just drifted away. And so the writer of Hebrews sees that, and he says that you must give more earnest heed to the things which you have heard, the teachings, lest we drift away. Look at chapter 3 in verse 1. He says, therefore, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling, consider the apostle and the high priest of our confession, Christ Jesus. So he's telling them to consider, keep in mind Jesus Christ, who we serve. And then in verse 8, he says to them, chapter 3, verse 8, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion in the days of the trial in the wilderness. So he's saying to them, don't be like the Israelites. Don't harden your hearts. So the audience he's speaking to, he knows what's happening. And so then in verse 12, chapter 3, verse 12, he says, beware, brethren, lest there be any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God, but exhorting one another daily. And so, again, he's picking up that in this crowd, in this group of Christians, and that's what they are, Christians, there's some things happening that aren't good. And in chapter 4, verse 1, therefore, since a promise remains of entering his rest, let us fear lest any of you seem to have come short of it. So we all know there's going to be a judgment, correct? We know that, and we work towards being able to get to heaven and hear those words, well done, thy good and faithful servant. We don't want to come just short of it. And then the last verse, chapter 4, verse 11, he says, let us therefore be diligent to enter the rest, lest anyone fall according to the same example of disobedience. So he's basically saying to them that they need to wake up. And then he says to them in verse 11, and he says, of whom we have much to say and hard to explain, since you have become dull of hearing. And then we have verse 12, which talks about the meat and the milk. But notice what he says in verse 11, that they've become dull of hearing. Tim talked in one of the things that he said that he's only missed one Sunday in all of his years. So think about how long you've been a Christian, how long you've attended church. How many sermons have you listened to? How many times have maybe we've fallen into that dull of hearing phase? Because we just we listen with our eyes open, but our minds closed. So as Christians, we have to be partakers of the Word. We can't just rely on Ned teaching, Mark preaching. We have to individually be partakers. We have to study. We have to learn more, to basically take meat. That's what we have to do. When you think about this verse and the way we live our lives as Christians, if we're to personally evangelize, then we have to be able to be a good example. And part of it is being able to teach. Now, everybody doesn't have to stand up like I'm doing now and teach a class. That doesn't have to be the teaching. The teaching is communication, the life that we live. All of us have people who we have an influence with in one way or another that we talk to. We could teach that way. We don't have to teach Bible, book, chapter, verse, and go through. We teach by our example. And then we lead people, and maybe someone else could help do the teaching. But as Christians, when we look at our life as a Christian, and where do I measure up? Am I a meat eater, or am I still on the milk? And you have to answer that question, because that's where you have to see where we are in our lives, because it's easy to just fall into that rut, that routine of life. And I think that's what they were doing here in Hebrews. They were dull of hearing. They were just kind of letting things happen. And here the writer's trying to wake them up and say, you need to be partakers. You need to get it. Any thoughts? Or okay. So let's look at 2 Peter chapter 1. And that'll be the gist of our class tonight. We won't get through it. But in 2 Peter chapter 1, I think that mainly we'll look at verse 5 and the following, but let's start in verse 1. 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 1. Simon Peter, a bondservant and apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who have obtained like precious faith with us by the righteousness of our Lord, of our God and Savior Jesus Christ, grace and peace be multiplied to you in the knowledge of God and of Jesus our Lord, as his divine power has given to us all things that pertain to life and godliness, through the knowledge of him who called us by glory and virtue, by which he has given us to exceedingly great and precious promises, that through these you may be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust. So his greeting is to faithful Christians. That's who he's speaking to here, faithful Christians who have basically escaped the corruption of the world, through the lust of the world at that time. And then he says in verse 5, but also for this very reason, the reason of the lust of the world, the corruption of the world, but also for this very reason, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge, and to knowledge self-control, and to self-control perseverance, and to perseverance godliness, and to godliness brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness love. That's what we're going to look at today, are those 7 items that we add. The first thing the writer does, though, because he's talking to a faithful group, he's assuming faith is there. That's the first assumption. I think we could do the same thing here. If you're here in class and you're a Christian, we have faith. And what is faith? Hebrews 11:1. What's faith? The substance of things hoped for, the assurance of things not seen. Who has seen heaven? None of us have we? No, we're still alive. We haven't seen heaven. But we have faith that heaven exists. And so it's that assurance of heaven that drives us. That's faith. We can look at James chapter 2, verses 14 through 26, and it talks about faith without works, it's dead. And we'll look at that. But we have to have faith. So first of all, the writer assumes faith is there. So we start with the foundation. If we're building a house, the foundation is faith. So if as a Christian, we're building our house on the rock, that foundation is faith. So when we look at this writing here in Peter, what Peter is saying is that we're Christians, we all have faith. That's the basis that we start with. We have faith. Now, to that faith, we need to add things. In order to be a Christian, that's going to be a partaker of the promises that were made to us. To be that Christian, we have to add to our faith these items. And so that's what I want us to discuss tonight and look at, is what do we add to our faith in order to be that Christian. And what I say is it'll be that Christian who no longer needs milk, but can can eat the meat, because they have the knowledge. Now, and when we look at knowledge, we'll look at that, but sometimes knowledge isn't just book, chapter, and verse. Knowledge is what it's all about. Why do I believe what I believe? And I don't have it written down, but we have a verse that says we always have to be ready to give an answer. Herschel, where's that? 1 Peter 3:15. We always have to be ready to give an answer. And so that's part of our knowledge part. We have to do that. So he says we have faith. So for this very reason, make every effort to add to your faith goodness knowledge. Now, the virtue, there's different words for it. There's different translations. But basically, virtue is goodness or virtue. And I'm not into Greek, but I do have it here what the Greek word says. Somewhere here. It deals with excellence or with merit. And so when we look at, when we have faith, and then we add virtue or courage, why would courage be the next item that he lists there? Yeah, to stand strong. Because no matter where you are in life, and we've talked about it before, it's not easy to accept rejection. And whenever you put yourself out there, it's easy to be rejected. And there's odds are, when we talk about church, odds are you're going to be rejected. But we have to have the courage, and that's what he says there. So first thing we have is faith. And then to that faith, we add a virtue, a goodness, a courage, a spiritual courage that we add to our faith, that we can be the Christian that's going to get us to heaven. And that's what we have to do there. So in the earlier verses, what he talks about is that we need to make every effort. And part of that, the key there, is effort. What's it mean to make an effort? To make an attempt? I mean, for those who had children and you say, make your bed, and you go in and you see they didn't even make an effort. The sheets aren't even on the bed, and you say, come on, give it at least do something. Make an effort. And that's what he's saying, that sometimes as Christians, we don't even make the effort. And we can't imagine us being that way, but there's times that we don't even make the effort to do it. And so he's saying that we have to make the effort. We have to diligently work to add to our faith goodness, virtue, courage. We have to do that. It's a practice. It's not something that's just going to happen. We have to do it. So the first item that he says is goodness. When we look at character flaws, we all have those, but sometimes do we make excuses for those? Well, my dad was always angry, so I'm always angry. Or whatever it might be, we have a tendency to make excuses for our actions sometimes, that, well, I just can't help it. When this happens, I do this or that. And we can't do that. I mean, we have to have the courage to be Christ-like. And it's work to be Christ-like, because how was Christ? He was perfect, wasn't he? I mean, he had the opportunity and the power to just wipe people out. I mean, most of us would say if we had his power, there'd be less people in the world, because there would be no traffic when I'm driving. I would just zap people but we don't do that. But Jesus had power. He could have, but he didn't do any of that. He never misused his power, because he knew his role, what he had to do. And he was perfect. We will never be perfect, but if we strive for perfection, then we get closer. But if we don't put forth the effort, That's where the ones who say to him, Lord, Lord, didn't I do in your name? Well, you might have did it once, but the effort wasn't there. So if we're going to be evangelists, if we're going to let our light shine, then we need to look at what it means to be a good Christian. We have to have the faith, and then we add to it the goodness. Goodness, or some versions put it as moral excellence. It has been said that this word also incorporates spiritual courage. It's the ability and desire to stand up for and display that which is right to a world that is rapidly declining morality. How often do we do that in our daily lives, where we talk to people about just things that we don't believe in, like abortion or gay marriage? Or do we let our light shine? Do we speak up, or do we just kind of remain silent and figure it's not worth the discussion? Because I think that's what it's talking about here. That's where spiritual courage comes in, that you say, well, no, I don't believe in same-sex marriage because it's against the laws of nature, it's against God. And that's what I believe in. And they may not talk to you again, but what have you lost if that's going to have somebody not talk to you? So part of that moral, that courage is, the virtue is the moral character. And when you think about morality, where is morality in our world today? Is it a high priority? No, it's not. I mean, it's morality no longer has a value in the world that we live in. But we as Christians have to let our morality shine every opportunity that we get. And we do have opportunities. That's part of that making an effort. And we can go back and look at Daniel and when we talk about what we have to do with that goodness and the virtue, let's look at, because it's not always easy, let's look at Matthew chapter 10, verse 28. Matthew 10, verse 28 says, "Do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell." So, worst case scenario is somebody would kill us if we stood up for Christ, but if we did, then we gain. We gain if that's the case. But in the world we live in today, as long as America is what it is, and we don't have to hide in our religion, we don't have to fear anyone. If we fear them, it's on ourselves. We're not being persecuted for meeting at the Alkire Road Church of Christ. So that's a fear we shouldn't have, but we need to fear God, who could sentence us to eternal damnation, to hell. So that's what we fear, not losing our bodies here on earth. And then Matthew 16, verse 24 tells us to deny himself and carry his. Jesus said anybody that would follow him needs to deny himself and carry his cross. So carrying his cross is a burden. So if somebody tells you that being a Christian is an easy thing to do, when Christ talks about bearing the cross, he wasn't talking about an easy path, was he? No, not at all. So when we talk about being a good Christian and being able to be an example and be able to evangelize, it's the life that we live. We teach by the way that we live. People should be able to tell, people who are around us at any point in time, for any time at all, should be able to tell by the morality that by our moral character, by the words that we say, by our actions, what kind of person we are. And in the same regard, we can pick that up, we read that from people that we're around. And you hear and see, whether it's restaurants or at work or whatever, we have an opportunity to let our light shine, but we have to practice these things. We have to make an effort. And some of the things that we'll look at, we'll talk about things like exercise and the things that we have to do, because we have to work at it and know that everything that we do every day of our lives, we have an opportunity to be a teacher. And we may not know it sometimes that we're doing that. Do you think the widow mite knew? The widow, when she put the mites in, the 2 mites, knew that that Jesus was watching and was going to use her as an example? No, that's just what she did. She didn't do it because Jesus was there. That's just what she did. And in the same regard, we do what we do because we do it, not because someone would see us. Okay? And another thing about virtue, like I said, it's just a general moral goodness. It's the ability to distinguish between what is right and what is wrong in your conduct. The only true way to add virtue to your life is to take a good look at how you're acting and admit when you could have acted better and make changes. The next item is knowledge. Knowledge is, in the Greek noun, is gnos, G-N-O-S-I-S. And I think Peter there is not talking about knowledge, but it's knowing God. It's knowing the God that we serve and what He demands of us and what He expects for us and what He's promised us. And that's what we do, is we know we have the knowledge of God, and that's what we work toward. Here he's talking about the knowledge of Scripture. He's talking about knowledge about how to live your life as a Christian. And we can put all those things into spiritually how the knowledge that we have as a Christian and what God expects, what Jesus did for us. You know, sometimes when we think about knowledge, it may be things that have happened to people that we know that we may not experience, but we can share those because of other people who have, like Costa Rica. We can talk about Costa Rica because we know firsthand our brothers who have gone and sisters who have gone to Costa Rica and what they shared. We can share that knowledge of foreigners or of other people who have accepted the Word and have been baptized almost immediately because of being preached the Word. So we can share that knowledge. So knowledge of the Most High God, of His ways, and the way we live our lives every day. Next thing that we add is self-control. Now this is probably a little bit more tougher. Self-control or temperance. The Greek word for it basically means the restraint of one's emotions, impulses, and desires. It's self-control. This virtue is one who masters his desires and passions. It could be an essential appetite. But self-control is what we all have to practice. How easy is it to lose our temper? Obviously, it depends on the person that you're in and the situation you're in. But isn't it easier to speak before we think? What usually happens when I open my mouth before I open my mind? I'm married, so before I say something, what usually happens in a marriage, the husband being the foolish of the two, what's he usually do, guilty, before I speak, before I think? You say something that you shouldn't say, that you wouldn't say if you thought about it. But because we have one mouth and two ears, we do this first. And when you talk about self-control, it's something we all, I know I have to work on. But it's things that we have to think of Jesus. And I always think of Jesus that he always thought before he spoke. Even though he knew an answer, I see Jesus as methodical and thinking and teaching and talking and well, not just blowing off at the top or like Peter. Now Peter, on the other hand, how was Peter? He was like me. No, Lord, I'll never deny you. No, not me. You know, I'll die for you. That's not me. Peter was one who spoke before he thought. And so as Christians, we have to look at situations that we're in. Because if we do let our light shine, and we do say we're somebody, that we're a Christian, then what are the people over here doing? What are they watching us do? Try to catch us slip up. Did you just say a cuss word? No, I didn't say a cuss word. Oh, I think you did. I mean, that's what happens when you do put yourself there. So that's where self-control comes in, and we have to work at it. We have to exercise it. And we have faith, we have virtue and goodness, we have knowledge, we have self-control. Self-control means that we have inner strength, and that's strong enough to restrain from our own desires, because it's easy to lash out at people and just let it out. They'll say, let the steam. Is that the bell? That's plane. Okay. So it's easy. It's something we have to work on, because it's easier for us to just let it off. Just Voice it. Go ahead, open up, tell me what you think. Sometimes you still don't want to tell them what you think. So, but self-control means that we have to work. We have to work on how we maintain a level and maintain that self-control, because as Christians, all it takes is one time to do something that's not self-control, that's thought of, like the example of the guy that left a penny tip. That wasn't self-control to leave a penny tip. Look at the effect it had, because I don't know that anybody from a Christian would ever be able to study with that lady again. Whatever opportunity, the door that was open there, it was probably slammed shut. So every action that we do does have an effect. We may not see it, but it will have an effect. So, self-control. Comments, questions before we get to the fourth one? We won't get to the fourth one, so. Nothing? Nobody? You're processing your self-control very well. That's 2 Timothy 3, 1 through 5. We'll turn there real quick. Second Timothy 3, 1 through 5, talking about self-control. But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come, for men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. From such people turn away. Did that not describe most of the people in the world today? In that verses 2 through 4, pretty much most of the world, lovers of money and boasters and blasphemers. So basically it's telling us to stay away from those folks, not be part of that. Okay, thank you.